When 35-year-old Ibrahim Traoré stepped off the plane in Nairobi, he wasn't greeted with honor. He was intercepted by a Kenyan official who quietly warned, "Watch your words, or face legal consequences." Rumors had already spread that Traoré would use the Africa Investment Summit to attack Western-backed leaders. Labeled as a troublemaker by diplomats behind closed doors, he walked into the venue under a cloud of suspicion. But what happened next no one expected. Traoré didn't come to ask for help, he came with evidence. In his hand, proof of secret bank transfers, false aid contracts, and the hijacking of new African money. If you believe Africa deserves leaders who stand tall against corruption. If you believe in a future built on dignity, not dependency. If the voice of Captain Ibrahim Traoré speaks to your heart, then don't just watch in silence. Like this video, share it with those who still believe in justice, and subscribe to this channel to join a growing community that refuses to be silent. Together, we're not just witnessing history, we're shaping it. As Ibrahim Traoré disembarked in Nairobi, he could already feel the tension in the air. The African Investment Summit was meant to symbolize cooperation, but for him, it felt more like a trap cloaked in fanfare. Just minutes after landing, a Kenyan official approached him discreetly. He smiled for the cameras, but his voice was cold. "For your own sake, Mr. President, stick to economic topics only. Legal repercussions can be inconvenient." It wasn't a warning, it was a threat. Traoré looked the man in the eyes, nodded politely, and walked away without a word. But inside, something had already shifted. The summit venue was grand, covered in banners reading "Africa Rising" and "Partnerships for Prosperity." Yet the faces behind the main sponsors were all too familiar. European consultants, Western banks, and multinational extractors dressed in Pan-African colors. William Ruto gave a stirring speech about economic growth and Africa's place in the global market, but beneath the applause, Traoré noticed the faces of silent diplomats from smaller African nations, unsure, unseen, unheard. He knew this wasn't about unity, it was about control. Traoré sat through the day's events with quiet intensity. He watched contracts being signed, deals being negotiated behind velvet curtains, and promises made to accelerate progress, but only if Africa stayed within the lines drawn for it. There were no discussions about sovereignty, no questions about ownership. Everything was structured around dependence, on aid, on foreign capital, on imported development plans. And yet, the hosts called it cooperation. For Traoré, it was a reminder of why he had come. That evening, he met with his team in a quiet hotel suite, where a small leather case lay on the table. Inside were documents, real ones, collected over months. Leaked agreements, bank transfers, internal memos. They revealed how infrastructure grants from international donors were being rerouted into shell companies linked to a circle of elites close to Ruto's administration. Projects that never broke ground had been fully funded on paper. The funds disappeared into tax havens while the people remained in poverty. It was textbook looting, just with better grammar. The next morning, Traoré walked onto the summit stage in silence. Cameras flashed. His aide handed him the expected speech, the diplomatic one. He folded it and placed it in his pocket. What followed was not a speech, but a confrontation. He spoke plainly, "African self-reliances will not be born in silence." Then he lifted the folder of evidence for the entire hall to see. Gasps broke out. Screens behind him displayed excerpts, transaction dates, account numbers, signatures. No names were spoken, but everyone knew. Traoré had been threatened with legal consequences if he spoke the truth. Instead, he used truth as the consequence. And in that moment, he was no longer a guest in a rigged forum, he was the symbol of a continent refusing to be bought. After the bombshell speech, the air inside the summit hall turned heavy. Some leaders politely clapped, unsure whether to support Traore or protect their own reputations. Others whispered urgently to aides, eyes darting between screens and the face of a young president who had just torn through layers of diplomacy with blunt truth. But outside the cameras, behind closed doors, the reaction was far colder. That evening, an emergency meeting was called by Kenyan officials. Traore was not invited. Representatives from several attending nations gathered to discuss the disruption he had caused. One delegate, from a West African country with close financial ties to France, openly called Traore's behavior reckless and divisive. Another, under pressure from foreign donors, described the speech as dangerously populist. No one mentioned the documents. No one questioned their authenticity. Instead, the focus turned to Traore himself, as if the real threat wasn't corruption, but the man who exposed it. The following day, a senior official from the African Development Alliance approached Traore's team. The tone was professional, but the message clear: President Traore must be cautious. There are consequences for undermining continental agreements. We all want African unity, but not at the cost of protocol. That word, protocol, was the new disguise for silence. Once again, unity was being used as a weapon against truth. And once again, Traore refused to yield. He called for a small press conference in the garden of the embassy compound where he was staying. Without banners or grand production, he stood before a few local journalists and said, African unity must not be confused with African conformity. What we build together must be rooted in honesty, not theater. He reminded the world that unity is not measured by the size of the stage, but by the integrity of its foundation. To remain silent in the face of theft is not solidarity, it's surrender. By that afternoon, footage of the press conference had begun to spread online, first in Ouagadougou, then across Francophone Africa, and finally through grassroots channels all over the continent. Activists reposted his words. Students marched in support. Even in Kenya, small groups began questioning what had really happened behind the curtain of the summit. Traore's isolation turned into a ripple of resistance. But what sealed the shift was a letter. An open letter, written by a respected elder statesman from southern Africa, was published the next day. In it, he addressed all African leaders directly. Young Ibrahim may have broken protocol, but what he preserved was our dignity. The line struck deep. It reframed the narrative from rebellion to reclamation. Traore had been accused of undermining African unity. But by refusing to protect corruption behind the mask of diplomacy, he reminded millions of what unity should mean: shared courage, not shared silence. And for the first time in decades, the word unity began to feel dangerous again, not because of what it covered, but because of what it could uncover. 2 days after the summit, the backlash intensified. An anonymous editorial appeared in one of Kenya's most prominent newspapers, calling Ibrahim Traore a destabilizing figure and questioning his readiness for international diplomacy. The article cited unnamed sources who claimed Traore had violated summit protocols, leaked classified economic data, and disrupted fragile alliances. Though it never directly named him, the implication was clear and calculated. The message to the public was that Traore was a rogue actor, not a reformer. Inside Burkina Faso's embassy in Nairobi, tension simmered. Several members of Traore's delegation reported being shadowed by unmarked vehicles. Meetings with potential partners were cancelled without explanation. One delegate received a letter from a multinational company threatening legal action over defamation and economic damage. The irony was bitter: those being exposed for corruption were now painting themselves as victims. Traore watched it all unfold without surprise. He had expected retaliation. What he didn't expect was how coordinated and shameless it would be. The next evening, a private dinner hosted by a Pan-African investment group was meant to ease tensions and show unity. Traore was invited, but when he arrived, he noticed he had been seated at the far end of the table, away from heads of state, near junior staff. It was a calculated insult, a silent message that he no longer belonged in the circle of power. Yet, he accepted it with calm resolve, greeting everyone with humility. Then, midway through the dinner, he stood up and raised a toast. "I was told to sit in the shadows," he said calmly. "But you forget, I come from a land where people eat in silence, but fight with fire. African self-reliances will not grow in air-conditioned rooms. They begin with sacrifice." The room froze. Glasses were left half-raised. No one clapped. And yet, in that moment, Traore's presence filled the room more than any protocol ever could. What followed was unexpected. A young minister from Sierra Leone stood up and echoed his words, "What he says is true. We speak of independence, but we fear discomfort. That must change." One by one, a few others followed, not many, but enough to shift the atmosphere from icy politeness to uncomfortable honesty. What had started as an effort to shame Traore had turned into an unintentional platform for awakening. Later that night, Traore met privately with a group of youth delegates, many of whom had been inspired by his speech and actions. They confessed their frustration at being sidelined, their fear of speaking out, and their admiration for what he had done. Traore didn't give them orders, he gave them questions. What will you build without fear? What will you defend without permission? The media called him isolated. The elites called him radical. But the youth, across borders and classes, called him something else, necessary. In the days following the summit, an official communiqué was quietly circulated among member states of the African Regional Cooperation Council. It proposed a new resolution, to uphold unity and preserve institutional decorum during continental gatherings. On the surface, the language appeared neutral. But embedded within the clauses were veiled condemnations of disruptive rhetoric, unsanctioned data disclosures, and behavior unbecoming of statesmanship. It was clear to anyone who had watched the summit, this was about Ibrahim Traoré. The document stopped short of naming him, but the intention was unmistakable. Traoré's bold speech and the evidence he presented had shaken too many chairs. Rather than investigate the corruption he had revealed, the institution closed ranks to protect itself. Behind the scenes, legal advisors from Kenya and 2 other states pushed to bar any future unscripted statements from summit stages, citing security risks. Once again, unity was being used to justify silence, not truth. Traore received a personal letter from the council's chair urging him to reaffirm his commitment to continental harmony and refrain from any further public disruptions. It was both a warning and a test. He could bend, apologize, and return to the fold. Or he could stand alone. His team debated strategy. Some advised diplomacy. Others feared isolation. But Traore did not hesitate. He called for an open press briefing. This time not just for journalists, but for the people. Standing beneath a modest white tent outside the embassy, he addressed the growing crowd of students, workers, and activists who had gathered to hear him speak. "They say I endangered unity," he began, his voice calm but firm. "But unity without integrity is nothing more than shared hypocrisy." Then he raised the council's letter before the cameras and tore it in half. "African unity," he continued, "must be earned through courage, not enforced through cowardice." The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in clarity. They saw in him not a rebel, but a reminder of what leadership was meant to be. That moment traveled faster than any official memo. It was shared across screens in Accra, Khartoum, Bamako, and Johannesburg. Activists repurposed the phrase, shared hypocrisy, into street murals. University forums began holding debates on the meaning of unity and who defines it. A documentary team from Senegal even began filming a short feature titled Unity on Trial. And something subtle, yet seismic, began to shift. When the council met again weeks later, a new delegation, led by young ministers from Mali, Togo, and South Sudan, refused to endorse the prior resolution. They called instead for a full audit of development funds distributed through the summit's partnerships. What began as an attempt to punish Traore had become a platform for reckoning. African unity, once the shield for corruption, was being reclaimed as a call for truth. And Traore, once threatened with silence, had become its loudest and most needed voice. A week after the summit, Ibrahim Traoré received a formal invitation to a closed-door roundtable hosted by a Western development bank operating across East Africa. The subject was strategic alignment for sustainable progress, but the real agenda was obvious: damage control. The organizers had grown nervous. Traoré's unexpected defiance, followed by the wave of youth support, had sparked uncomfortable questions among their African partners. They hoped to rein him in quietly, away from cameras and crowds. Upon arrival, Traoré was ushered through a back entrance and seated between two senior financial advisors. The tone was polished, the smiles rehearsed. After a few minutes of polite talk, one of the bankers leaned forward and said, "Mr. President, independence is admirable, but interdependence builds stability. We urge you to moderate your rhetoric, for the sake of regional trust." The message was clear: back down, or face being sidelined from future economic cooperation. Traoré didn't respond immediately. He looked around the room, at the polished floors, the imported suits, the quiet hum of controlled air, everything that felt so far removed from the dry villages of the Sahel, where a single water pump could mean life or death. They spoke of stability, yet profited from a continent kept unstable. They spoke of progress, yet funded regimes that crushed it. For a moment, the silence in the room felt like a verdict on every promise ever broken to Africa. Then he spoke. Calmly. "African self-reliances," he said, "does not mean cutting ties. It means cutting chains." The bankers blinked. He continued, "What frightens you is not my tone. It is the idea that we might learn to build without your permission." Before the meeting ended, Traoré handed them a dossier prepared by his ministry, outlining a plan for Burkina Faso to partner directly with local cooperatives, renewable energy startups, and Pan-African engineers. It bypassed international lenders entirely. It wasn't a threat. It was a blueprint. And it signaled a future no longer dependent on foreign approval. The following day, a leaked memo from the bank labeled Traoré's posture as a risk to investment climate. It made its way into the hands of a regional journalist, who published it under the headline, "They fear the one who stands alone." The story went viral. Memes and posters spread across campuses with that phrase below Traoré's photo. His stance had become more than political, it had become cultural. In a final twist, a coalition of African tech entrepreneurs reached out to his office. Inspired by his defiance, they offered to fund the first phase of his infrastructure plan through independent platforms. No middlemen. No foreign interest rates. Just Africans investing in Africans. What began as a private warning ended in a public movement. Traoré had been called too bold, too unpredictable. But history doesn't remember those who followed orders. It remembers those who redrew the lines. And Traoré was doing just that, with no script, no safety net, and no apology. The story of Ibrahim Traoré at the Nairobi Summit is not simply a tale of defiance. It is a roadmap for reclaiming dignity in a continent too often asked to be grateful for its own exploitation. From the moment he landed, he was misunderstood, branded as a disruptor, and subtly threatened by forces more interested in optics than outcomes. Yet, through every insult, isolation, and attempt to silence him, Traoré held firm. The lesson begins there. Leadership is not the art of being liked, it is the discipline of being loyal to your people, even when the cost is high. For too long, African unity has been interpreted as uniformity, an unspoken agreement to remain silent about the rot within, so long as we appear united without. That illusion, while comforting to elites, has proven disastrous for ordinary citizens. Traore broke that illusion. He reminded us that unity forged in cowardice is not unity at all, it is collusion. True unity demands confrontation. It demands that we call out corruption, even when it wears our colors and speaks our language. When Traore lifted those documents on stage, he did more than expose a scandal. He exposed a pattern, how institutions built in the name of development have become tools of delay, how foreign partnerships often disguise dependency, and how too many leaders have traded long-term sovereignty for short-term praise. His act was not a betrayal of African diplomacy, it was a rescue mission for its soul. It taught us that sometimes, the most African thing a leader can do is say no. The response he received, media attacks, veiled legal threats, and diplomatic cold shoulders, only confirmed the power of his message. When you speak the truth in a room built on lies, you become the threat. But Traore did not respond with bitterness. He responded with clarity. He framed self-reliance not as isolation, but as self-respect. His speeches became declarations, not just for Burkina Faso, but for every African nation trapped in the performance of progress while stuck in cycles of dependence. And perhaps the most powerful part of this story is what happened outside the summit halls. Young people heard him. Activists, students, even low-level bureaucrats began to ask harder questions, not only of their leaders, but of themselves. The courage Traore displayed was contagious. It sparked a shift, from watching history unfold to shaping it. That is the true power of leadership, not in commanding crowds, but in awakening them. Another critical lesson from Traore's stance is the redefinition of diplomacy itself. Western-trained elites have long insisted that diplomacy must be quiet, polite, and compliant. But that model has failed Africa repeatedly. Traore's form of diplomacy is raw, grounded, and confrontational, not for the sake of theater, but for the sake of truth. He has reminded the continent that confrontation is not the opposite of peace, it is often the precondition for justice. Equally important is his rejection of the idea that Africa must ask permission to imagine something better. Traore's vision of African self-reliances isn't built on anti-Western sentiment for its own sake, but on the radical idea that Africa already possesses what it needs, talent, resources, and willpower. What it lacks is the political courage to tell old systems, we will build our own. In this way, Traore is not simply a president, he is a signal. A signal that the post-independence generation has run out of excuses, and the next generation has run out of patience. His message is uncomfortable for many, because it disrupts business as usual. But comfort. When Traore was placed at the end of the table, when others ignored him, when letters of condemnation circled behind closed doors, those were attempts to contain his influence. But integrity, once made visible, becomes uncontainable. His very exile became his power. And that paradox teaches us this: you do not need permission to be right. Finally, the most sobering lesson of all is that change rarely starts with a crowd. It starts with one person willing to lose everything for something greater. Traore didn't start a movement by giving people what they wanted, he started one by giving them what they needed, a mirror, a challenge, a voice. So what is the lesson of Ibrahim Traoré? It is that African unity must be based on shared truth, not shared silence. It is that African self-reliances begin not with policies, but with posture. And most of all, it is that in a world trained to reward obedience, the most revolutionary act is to speak with your own voice, even when no one claps. The audience response to Ibrahim Traoré's actions at the summit was overwhelming, and deeply emotional. Many viewers commented that they had never before seen an African leader speak with such clarity, courage, and raw honesty on an international stage. One user wrote, "This is not just a president, this is what true representation looks like. He doesn't speak for Africa. He speaks as Africa." Another shared, "When he tore up that letter, I didn't just see paper, I saw fearlessness." Others reflected on how his stance challenged the hypocrisy that had long been accepted as normal. For years, we were told that being silent was being diplomatic. But watching Traore, I realized that silence has cost us everything, one woman from Côte d'Ivoire commented. A young man from Uganda echoed that sentiment. "I was raised to believe unity meant obeying whoever had the most money. Now I know it means standing with whoever has the most truth." Some viewers connected Traore's message to their personal lives. A university student from Senegal shared how the speech inspired him to question the curriculum at his economics department. "Why are we still being taught development models from countries that colonized us?" Traore's words made me realize it's not just politics that needs to change, it's education too. Another viewer in the diaspora, living in France, admitted feeling ashamed for not seeing the manipulations behind foreign aid earlier. "He ripped the mask off an entire system," they said. "And I can't unsee it." There were also viewers who admitted they didn't fully understand the significance of the summit at first, but something about the way Traore stood alone made them pay attention. "I don't follow politics much," wrote a young woman from Zambia, "but when I saw how they treated him at that dinner, seated at the edge, ignored, and then how he stood up and still spoke the truth. That's when I realized this was bigger than politics. It was personal. It was about dignity." Critically, many young Africans saw in Traore not just hope, but instruction. "He didn't give us slogans, he gave us permission," a Nigerian activist commented. Permission to question, to disrupt, to lead without waiting for approval. A commenter from South Africa simply wrote, "He is not the future. He is the proof that the future has already begun." Even those who disagreed with Traore's methods acknowledged his impact. "Maybe he was too confrontational," one viewer mused, "but maybe that's what we need. We've tried politeness. It didn't free us." In the end, the comment section became more than reaction, it became reflection. It became a mirror of the very change Traore had hoped to inspire. Not just claps or praise, but real, uncomfortable, necessary questions. And in that sense, the viewers didn't just watch history unfold. They became part of it.